The promise of a cold beer after work is a powerful motivator for every man, woman, and child on this earth. The story of Bavarian beer begins 7,000 years ago. Someone cooked some porridge, and yeast, a fungus, happened to get into that porridge. When this happens, yeast makes alcohol, and that's how we got beer. Spoiled porridge inspired people in every corner of the earth to independently pursue brewing, the art of making beer. However, there is one corner of the earth that contributed the most to the beer we have today, and that is Bavaria. If you wanted a beer in 7th century Europe, you'd probably have to brew it yourself from grain that you farmed. This kind of beer would still honestly resemble porridge more than anything and would have barely any alcohol in it. Still, any alcohol is better than nothing, and it was a good use of spare grain. If you wanted a beer that was actually good, especially in Bavaria, you'd have to go to a monastery. Now, if you need a refresher, a monastery existed for the purpose of understanding the glory of the Christian God and His creation. You were meant to become spiritually enlightened, reading the Bible constantly and living by strict rules. Monks couldn't leave or even interact with normal people without permission from the head of the monastery, the abbot. Most of your days were spent praying, doing communal chores, and learning. Monks were some of the most knowledgeable people in the land, as they believed that understanding the physical world would help them understand the spiritual one. The major advantage to becoming a monk is that you didn't actually have to fear for your survival, as monasteries enjoyed a steady income since they owned land and the peasants living on that land. They took the role of a feudal lord and took money from the peasants to pay for their own lifestyle. Monasteries became centers of beer brewing because monks, like all Christians, had to fast. But fasting makes you really tired, and they didn't want it getting in the way of their work. Since they had the cash, the time, and the skills, they brewed really thick and calorie-dense beer to give them energy. The first monastery to have a dedicated brewery may have been St. Columban in St. Gallen in Switzerland, where beer may have been brewed from as early as 612. In Bavaria, it is likely that beer was brewed at the Weihenstephan monastery sometime after its opening in 830. They still make beer today, but this brewery likely has roots in the 15th century. The oldest actual brewery still making beer, both in Bavaria and in the world, is located in the Weltenburger Kloster, which has existed since at least 1050. Even after all this time, it remains under the control of the monks, though these days they probably don't have to brew the beer themselves. A further surprising advantage that the monks had, especially in Bavaria, was that beer wasn't that popular. Back then, people would only drink beer if they couldn't get wine. And Bavaria actually had plenty of wine-growing regions. In the north of Germany, there was no wine, and monasteries were faced with a far more developed market dominated by private breweries. This meant people focused on selling beer now rather than improving it for the future. But how do you actually brew beer? It's quite simple. Beer is a grain-based drink. Most people use barley, but you can use whatever you like. Whatever you choose, you need to malt it. Malting prepares the grain for brewing by getting it wet and then drying it, possibly roasting it as well. The exact malt used is responsible for most of the difference in taste. The malt is mashed together with water, causing the grains to break apart. Once this has happened, this liquid is filtered and flavored. Almost all beer today is flavored with hops, an herb that gives beer that distinct bitter edge. The hops balance the sweetness of the malt. After filtering again, fermentation is started by adding yeast to the liquid. which converts sugars to alcohols. After that, beer is conditioned, which means it is stored in a cold tank for a few weeks or months. This intensifies the flavors. After that point, you can bottle the beer or just serve it directly. Law and beer went hand in hand. Legal obligations were placed on brewers from the earliest days of statutory law for a number of reasons. Firstly, there was a general consensus that people who sold beer that was unfit for human consumption should be punished, which is reflected in Augsburg's communal code from 1156. Additionally, this was a time of great food insecurity. Crop failures and famines could and did result in many people dying, and the powers that be often banned the brewing of beer during bad harvests, or at least restricted it, so you could only brew it from the least nutritious grain, which is barley, as was the case in Nuremberg from 1303 onward. Monks actually were often at an advantage during times like these, as they were usually exempt from the restrictions on brewing, allowing them to keep improving. This is due to the fact that monks, especially in the big, flashy monasteries, were a bunch of nepo babies. Only one son could inherit his father's title, so for many younger brothers, monasteries were a way to keep living a comfortable life. They were often established with this purpose in mind. It is then obvious that the nobility in charge would want to keep their children happy and well fed. In 1487, Munich, the capital of Bavaria both then and now, passed their own beer law, stating that only barley, hops, and water can be used in the brewing of beer. This time there was no famine, but there were plenty of other reasons for why this law was adopted. The quality of beer had been suffering, as brewers often watered down their product or used cheap substitutes. Banning these ingredients did help people's health, but it was also a self-made problem, as the prices of beer were set by the state. If the cost of barley went up one year, brewers could not compensate losses by raising prices. They were forced to cut corners to still make a profit. Something curious is that at this time, different herb mixtures were being used to flavor beer. As you might remember, these days we mainly use hops. That herb mixture was called a Grout, and everyone had their own version, but common ingredients included both normal stuff like juniper, but also poisonous and psychoactive stuff like nightshade. Drinking Grout beer, even if brewed correctly, could really mess you up if it used one of these ingredients. Mandating that hops specifically be used did help people's health. But these kinds of herbs were also associated with folk medicine and witches. So cracking down on evil, demonic Grout in favor of a more purely Christian drink would have been very on brand for Europe at this time. Eventually, the Duke of Bavaria, Wilhelm IV of the Wittelsbachs, regulated beer throughout his entire domain through the Reinheitsgebot in 1516. It said the same things as the Munich version, restricting beer to barley, hops, and water. This version of the law would come to be loved and adored by all, with beers brewed in Bavaria today proudly stating that they are brewed according to this tradition. However, this adoration hides some history. A short while later, in 1551, other ingredients like coriander and bay leaves were permitted, and in 1548, a local noble of the Degenberg dynasty was even granted permission to brew wheat beer. After the 1600s, these laws even faded into obscurity and weren't revived until the 1860s at the earliest. This means that a lot of recent Bavarian brewing history was not actually guided by the Purity Law. Back in the latter half of the 1500s, Europe and Bavaria were going through a tough time. Bavarian wine was on the way out. The taste and size of the grape harvest varied too unpredictably, and a long period of unsuitable weather between 1553 and 1628 allowed beer to take over as the #1 drink. While wine was declining, the Bavarian Duke schemed to use the increasing popularity of beer for his own aims. The Degenburgs, who received permission to brew wheat beer, died out in 1602. As a result, that privilege passed back to the Duke, who set up his own monopoly on wheat beer, building wheat beer breweries in the whole state. This included Munich, where the Hofbräuhaus was upgraded and expanded around 1607 to produce wheat beer. Wheat beer, known as Weissbier or white beer today, had to be sold at every tavern, otherwise their license would be withdrawn. As you can imagine, this scheme resulted in significant income for the Duke, who managed to stabilize the entire budget of Bavaria this way and pay back debts taken on by his dad. The monopoly was more bad news for the monasteries, which had been suffering for a while due to the effects of the Protestant Reformation. Following this, things were pretty stable for a few centuries until wheat beer gradually fell out of favor with the consumers, and by 1798, the monopoly was formally abolished. From that point on, we start to see the triumph of the lagers in Bavaria. To understand the lager, we need to go back to the fermentation process. Yeast is used to convert sugar to alcohol, but you can choose what kind of yeast you want. You can choose to have an ale yeast or a lager yeast. There's not much difference in taste. The main difference is actually temperature. Ales, historically, were made in the summer and lagers in the winter, due to the two yeasts being effective at different temperatures. There wasn't much spare grain in the winter, so lagers weren't that relevant. Bavarians had managed to make some progress in perfecting lagers since the nearby Alps provided a cool environment, even in the summer. A major advantage of lager is that it is less likely to spoil, since it is made so cold and bacteria don't spread much. This is probably why more beer today is a lager and not an ale. A lot of effort was dedicated to increasing the output of lager beer. First, breweries dug cellars under the shade of chestnut trees. These spots actually developed into Biergarten, as people found drinking beer in the shade surrounded by trees to be quite nice. To further increase the production of lager beer, breweries in Munich approached Karl von Linde, a professor at the Technical University. They wanted a cooling machine, essentially a refrigeration system that they could use to make lager year-round. And by 1873, he installed a prototype at the Spaten brewery. This was one of the first commercial applications of cooling systems anywhere in the world and shows how brewing was quickly industrializing. This all culminated in a beer boom, as all kinds of beer could now be brewed year-round and exported without going bad. As beer production rose, doubling between 1873 and 1913 to 2 billion liters, the breweries developed into fully fledged independent companies. Today, in 2024, there are 6 major breweries in Munich. Looking into their history unites most things we have talked about so far. There is Hofbräu from the times of the royal monopoly on wheat beer, Paulaner and Augustiner, which both stem from local monasteries, as well as Spaten, Löwenbräu, and Hacker-Pschorr, all 3 of which used to be privately owned breweries that adjoined taverns. They all rose to nearly worldwide prominence around this time, helped, of course, by marketing. Reviving the Reinheitsgebot was great for business. In 1906, it was passed into law across all of Germany, stating that lagers can only be made with malt, yeast, hops, and water, though ales made in North Germany could also use sugar. A government guarantee of pure beer must have been a great help. While beer and Oktoberfest are currently synonymous, it was not always so, as beer was first sold there in 1880, 70 years after the first one. Just as with the Reinheitsgebot, companies used Bavarian history to set themselves apart from their competitors and turned the Oktoberfest into the beer extravaganza we know it as. It all worked, and exports to other countries rose. By 1913, just before the First World War, 10% of all beer on Earth was being brewed in Bavaria. There were different types of lager beer that gained popularity during this time. Earlier lagers, at least in Munich, tended to be darker. The barley was roasted during the malting process, and that resulted in a dark, somewhat sweet, somewhat chocolatey beer called the Dunkles. While that hype was raging, Pilsner beer was developed elsewhere in Bavaria. Pilsner beer is extremely popular today. A lot of major brands like Bud or Heineken are Pilsners, and though you might find some Bavarian Pilsner, it is mostly popular outside of Bavaria. When breweries in the Czech and North German lands started mass manufacturing this kind of beer, it really threatened the market position of the Bavarian breweries, so they cooked up the Helles. This beer is a more lightly hopped, so less bitter take on the Pilsner. Introduced around 1894, the Helles eventually became the most popular type of beer after the 1940s and still holds the top spot. These days, beer is still loved and adored. Bavarians drink about 125 liters of beer per person per year. If Bavaria was its own country, it would come second in per capita beer consumption. The Oktoberfest is the largest festival of its kind, seeing over 7 million visitors last year, as many as ever. And the beer itself is honestly delicious. And the diversity of tastes and types means that there is something for everyone. The Reinheitsgebot remains in force despite some legal challenges that made the sale of different kinds of beer from other parts of Germany and the rest of the EU possible. But does this come at a cost? To answer that question, we need to understand the current role of the Reinheitsgebot. Those who favor strictly adhering to the Reinheitsgebot in its current version say it helps preserve part of Bavarian culture. I would argue that this law actually works against that aim, as you can't brew many traditional recipes such as Grout beers. Bavarian brewers and legislators have successfully lobbied for the recognition of Bavarian beer as a culturally significant product in the rest of the EU. Only beer brewed in Bavaria according to certain rules is considered traditional Bavarian beer. If you already have recognition of this heritage, and if customers can already buy any kind of beer that they want, the only practical purpose of this law today is to erect a barrier to competition. What I see here is a problematic relationship between the corporations and the government, otherwise known as corruption. The breweries bring in money and prestige and can do business on favorable terms in return. The sad reality is that today, if the Reinheitsgebot were to be struck down, the only difference would be that small-scale breweries could offer niche brews that in turn could perhaps fragment the market a little bit and steal a few customers from the huge brands. It is a shame how this heritage has been appropriated by corporations who think they know better. I happen to think that more choice can never hurt.